Please welcome to the stage freelance narrative designer Alastair Brown.
Oh, how are we all doing? Can everyone hear me? Awesome, I'll take that as a resounding yes. Right, let's just get stuck into it then. I'm not being blinded by the sun anymore, so that's a bonus as well. Hi, my name is Alastair, and today I'm going to be talking about great expectations of a narrative designer. Now, why this? It's a subject I get enough recurring questions on from graduates and students, that question usually being some theme of how do I become a narrative designer? But it's worth going over the role and helping to demystify it and helping establish common expectations with it. Don't worry, you've not missed much. Additionally, there's a lot of overlap between this question and another one I often get asked, which is how do I quickly go from graduate to a lead? To the point I think there is a lot of similar expectational overlap between being a lead and being a narrative designer. Namely, this is mostly people confusing being a narrative designer with being Hideo Kojima or Neil Druckmann and getting to dictate how an entire studio spends more than 3 years on delivering the next groundbreaking, cerebral, subversive, in-depth, character-driven auteur project. Now, first and foremost, that's people getting confused narrative design with the position of a creative director, but even then, that isn't really what most narrative design positions will be in large studios, nor is it really what narrative design positions are likely to be in small indie teams, nor is it what you should really be doing if you're doing it as a student project. So with that in mind, the aim of this talk is to outline the following. So we're going to go over when the clicker works, expectations of a narrative position, outline what the position typically is, go over what typically makes good best practices for a narrative designer to have, cover companies and narrative design expectations at different studios, and hopefully we've got time for a Q&A. If not, this goes in the lunch, so I'll be hanging around and you can ask me questions. Now, hopefully at the end of this talk, you will all have a better understanding of what a narrative designer position is, and even if that's not what you want to do with your career, how other departments and the specialist design field intersect. This talk is fairly personal experience driven. Obviously, I haven't worked as a narrative designer at every studio that has ever shipped a game, but the general message of the talk should hopefully help deliver on the points we've got on the board here, and help give you an idea of what a narrative designer is or is not. This is also fairly dialogue delivery driven versus written text driven. Not that there is an overlap between the two, it's just something that I want to highlight going forward. So, as this is personal experience driven, let's quickly go over my personal experiences. So I'm Alastair, which we've covered. I graduated from Staffordshire University back in 2012 with a degree in gameplay design and production. That same year, I did what used to be called Dare to be Digital, but is now Dare Academy up at Abertay University. With a 2-2 in Dare at the top of my CV, I went racing straight into call centres for 2 years because I just love getting yelled at by strangers about their overdrafts that much. After 2 years of applying for jobs, I ended up at Rebellion as a creative skill set quality assurance trainee analyst. Not content with having the longest job title in the company, I stuck around and spent 2 years in QA before moving on to design in 2016, where I worked as a narrative or dialogue designer in some shape or form on Strange Brigade, Zombie Army 4, Sniper Elite 5, leaving during the development of Atomfall and Sniper Elite Resistance to go work at Cloud Imperium Games on Squadron 42 as a lead narrative designer, before most recently working with Abracam and Paradox Studios on Stellaris to deliver Biogenesis and Shadows of the Shroud DLC this year for that game. Now I am enjoying the independent freelance grind as my contract is over. So, before we get into the meat of this talk, there is just one last little bit of expectation management that I like to throw into these. Getting a job in games is difficult. Getting a job as a narrative designer even more so, but it is not impossible. Having said that, narrative design is to design what concept art is to art. You are an extremely specialist subdiscipline. Most studios will only have one of you on staff at most. A large amount will outsource your job to external companies, and in others, you will be a small part of a larger team writing reload lines for the better part of 3 years. I'm not saying this to dissuade anyone from going into this job. I like this job. The more people that do this job well, the better games that are made as a result. However, as I've just outlined, I left university and I worked in call centres for 2 years. Statistically speaking, this will happen to you as well. Do not let it get you down, just you are not likely to walk into this field straight out of university, especially given the state of the industry at the minute. So on that super upbeat note, what is a narrative designer? A lot of people see the job title, a narrative designer, and just expect or assume that being a narrative designer is synonymous with being a writer. Now, while writing is a large part of most narrative designer skill sets, it's a large oversimplification to just write off a design job as only including writing, without doing anything to actually get what you wrote into the game and triggering for the end user. This job is vastly different per studio, and even seniority in the same field. Case in point, I've been doing this job since Strange Brigade in the far-off year of 2016, and I have done the following: script writing, collectible writing, mission objective writing, mission dialogue writing, BARC writing, shoot doc and recording script prep. This clicker is taking its time. Localization work, character description text, dialogue systems implementation, per level dialogue implementation, narrative pipeline implementation, technical dialogue and documentation, outsource management, writing style training, level design, game design, narrative documentation, writing and upkeep, technical onboarding, and marketing text support. But if we put all that into a Venn diagram, because Venn diagrams are fun, we get the following. So as we can all see, there's a lot of overlap here between the three studios I've worked at, but one drastically involved a lot more work than the others as a narrative designer, whereas we can see in the image, senior designer, brackets, narrative and dialogue. Now, some of this shift is obviously because I've moved from senior to a lead role, but the main point I'm trying to highlight here is that depending on the studio, your workload as a narrative designer is likely to be very different. The same is true with other disciplines. Some studios, if you're a level designer, you're expected to do your own collision mesh, while at other places that falls under art because it's 3D modeling. Keeping on narrative though, if we take a look outside of my own experiences and just look over some job specs for narrative design roles, we can see additional skill sets that aren't on this list. So with this role, as a senior narrative designer, we can see things that weren't there previously, making use of Maya and in-house tools. Speaking from experience, in-house tools come with onboarding, although the effectiveness of that onboarding is different from studio to studio. Partnering with writing to champion the narrative experience. Most likely with this role, you will not be writing the final written text in the role. Experience in game editors, production tools, engines, etc. Reading through this is something I would likely put under a technical narrative remit at some studios, but there's a lack of consistency between job titles in the discipline. After that, we've got narrative designer. In this role, you are once again collaborating with multiple departments as well as briefing writers to create scripts, with a much bigger focus on documentation, workflows, pipelines, good understanding of timing, pacing, and flow. Lots of this stuff falls under what I would expect of a narrative design role, but again, I'm saying this as someone that has worked in studios where narrative designers are the principal writers, as well as the outsource managers for external writers. What both of these have in common, and what I'm going to try and focus on throughout the talk, is that there's lots of collaboration skills with understanding of technical documentation and design work. So what I'm trying to drill home here is that if you want to be a narrative designer, then lots of studios have different ways to break down that job role, to the point that narrative design might not even be your job title. You could be a narrative designer, you could be a dialogue designer, you could be a content designer, you could be a writer, you could stick the word technical in front of all of these job roles, or you could work at a studio where you're just a designer and a narrative design credit never gets handed out because it falls under a subset of your job responsibilities. Additionally, with the dialogue designer role, this can end up being a more audio-focused discipline as you're expected to handle audio capture, editing, mastering, and implementation of the final assets. So with all this in mind, what is a good narrative designer? They're not just a writer who holds themselves up in a tower and produces the next literary genre-defining story of a generation. Most times what people are looking for when they're looking for a narrative designer is, in fact, a unicorn. Now, what do I mean by this? There are 1,000 writers to every narrative designer. If you currently want to be a narrative designer because all you want to do is be a writer, you are joining a huge talent pool that, to be honest, isn't really something people look to draw from long term. However, a unicorn would be able to take the plot or the story being dictated to them from on high by the studio CEO and get it from page into the game, triggering for the end user. Expectations of a good narrative designer are, as we've just outlined, usually engine and documentation driven. If you have working technical knowledge of how to implement narrative into the game you're working on versus just writing up the content, that alone sets you apart from a huge pool of talent already. Now, even then, narrative designers are not an island or a force unto themselves. Having good technical consideration for how other departments are affected by your workload goes a long way, and you should expect it to be a part of your skill set in this or any job role in the industry. A huge part of my own experience has been focused on being able to collaborate with other disciplines to facilitate smooth delivery pipelines throughout a project's lifetime and making sure the work I'm doing not only fits the tone of the game or the player's expectations, but is not a massive slog for other departments to have to deal with. So, with that in mind, getting narrative or dialogue into the game, aka why writing is actually a really small part of being a narrative designer. So in terms of technical work that goes into getting a line triggering in-game, let's start off with something simple, a global bark, and the work that goes into just writing that line. Now for context, a global bark, or as they can also be called wild lines, or just barks, are things like reloading, enemy spotted, I'm low on health, I found an item, I've picked up a shotgun, etc. I call them global barks because they're barks that can trigger globally across the game versus mission-specific barks, which of course are different to mission-specific dialogue chains. Again, it's different per studio in both terminology and as well as engine specifics, because every engine is different, but good best practices are universal. So, Strange Brigade. For those of you who have not played it, wait until it's on sale for £3, absolute steal. In Strange Brigade, as you can see, there are cat statues. If you shoot all 5 of them, you unlock the golden cat door at the end of the level and get all of the cat gold. Strange Brigade has a narrator mechanic. It is an omnipresent character who will occasionally drop absolute gems, as you can see on screen. For those of you who cannot read the text, it reads, "Ha ha ha! 9 lives won't stop that little beast." Now, to get this line in game, here is a rough breakdown of what's needed before we even write the line. Losing my place. So I'm using Strange Brigade as an example because, as you can see here, it is a title that worked from a spreadsheet, not from any form of complex data systems in Engine. And spreadsheets are a lot of what you're going to be staring at as a narrative designer, even if you are using a complex data system to start with. So to start with, before we even write that line, we need the file name. The file name is what the engine is going to have to look up. It's what the audio team are going to need to know when creating final edits of the line. It's what designers are going to need to know to hunt down from a database that you should be making and keeping organized as you go, so that they can hook it up in-game without level scripting. This is the file name structure that I like to use. It's basically the file name structure that I've been using since Rebellion and the legacy systems that were built around it. I still use it because I find it a solid best practice. I'm not showing you this to say this is what you must do. It just makes sense to me and the teams that I work with, which is the rule that I would suggest sticking to. Use file names that you can break down and easily explain to other departments. Now with that in mind, here's a breakdown of these file names. So to start with, you've got MXX and the level name, so M00 global is a global line. If it was a level name, MO1 underscore coast or dig site or train station. After that, you've then got the info, so in the context of the original line, player shoots cat, or intro vista comment. It is an intro comment in the opening vista of the level. This is all stuff that should make sense to both you and the team involved with the project. Sequence 01, the first line in a sequence, is the first line in a conversation. If this was something that had 2 sequences and was a global bark, that would be something like AI, I've spotted the enemy. So sequence 1, enemy spotted. Sequence 2, confirmed, moving on his position. Speaker ID, the character in question doing the talking. In the event of the line I've shown, it's the narrator. If this was a player character, it'd be something like Carl, Gracie. Or if it was AI, Ger Grunt 01 or Ger Off 02, German Grunt 1 and German Officer 2. After that, you've got the variant number. So if this is a global bark, you're obviously going to want to hear more than just reloading over and over. So variant 1, reloading. Variant 2, changing mags. Variant 3, I'm out of ammo, swapping clips, etc. After that, we get the context and the localization context. This breaks down what the actual context of the line is. You should make this as detailed as possible because this is instructions to other departments or to the localization team or to the actors on the day of recording. You are not writing this in a vacuum. You are writing this to make sense to 10 other people at a minimum, as well as yourself in 3 months' time, because you will not remember your shorthand that you did in a rush speaking from experience. Make this clear and concise. After that, we've got your speaker character. In this case, it's the narrator. This can be for something as easy as organization of a database, or it can be a data set that the engine checks to make sure that line triggering matches the player skin being used by the actor in question. After that, you've got face type, similar thing. Narrator obviously doesn't have a face, it's a disembodied voice, but in a player-facing game, the player characters have faces. Alien characters, if you're working on something that has different facial structures. Animation needs to know this. The system needs to know this. It's worth tracking that information. After that, you get the line template. I know that this is a narrator VO global, so that means it's got lower priority in the queue because it's a global line that you can hear often. Story VO would interrupt it. Player character VO would interrupt it because player character VO is being driven by the player's actions. Then we hit line text finally. This is what is getting said by an actor, a dev voice while you're waiting for actors to come in, or Robo VO if you really need to rush it and trigger the line for testing purposes. Again, this is all very driven towards a Rebellion and Cloud Imperium pipeline. Abracam was more text-focused, so dialogue considerations didn't massively apply, but the general universal organization stuff did. There's then, of course, the thing of that's proprietary tech versus Unreal or Unity Studio pipelines to take into account. All of this leads to systemic differences throughout studios, but as I said, there are at least universal best practices that apply across the board. Hopefully, this is helping outline what goes into narrative design beyond just fancy narrative and compelling stories. There's a lot of other considerations to go into playing dialogue out if we look at a bit more something in-game, like a mission dialogue chain. So, everything I've mentioned already has been taken into consideration with this, only now it's an actual, physical, in the level AI versus an omnipresent narrator. So we have a whole new slew of things to take into consideration, which I'm going to rattle through as quickly as possible so we can all avoid looking at that horrific run-on sentence. You've got a direct naming of another AI in the level. We're calling out someone called Kurt Meyer. In Sniper, you can tag enemies and see their names and their hobbies. So if we're calling out Kurt Meyer in dialogue, there better be a Kurt Meyer that I can find in the level, which is a conversation with the level designer and the rest of the team. These are, of course, AI, so what if I go in guns blazing? How are they going to react? Can they go back to neutral and continue where they left off? If they can't, what about the information that they were revealing? Can I find it elsewhere? Have I potentially just soft-locked the game by making the player unable to discover this information? What if the player runs down the hall and triggers another equally as important conversation about radio codes? Are the conversations spaced out enough in the level? How long is it taking for these lines to be delivered? Can you hear both at the same time and cause overlap of subtitles and dialogue? In addition to all of this, and speaking of subtitles, it's being delivered in German in this case, so localization plays a huge factor in this pipeline. Non-English speaking characters have to have their dialogue written up first, sent out to localizers for it to then come back and be put into a recording script, so that on the day the native Germans can go, we don't actually talk like that. We would say it like this, so you then get to update it in real time as they come in. All of these considerations and more need to be taken into account when writing for games or when handling in-game narrative elements. The bleed on from the points I've just mentioned here are just a small part of it. Again, there's lots I've not even covered, so let's go over it now. So next you've got vocalizations or get hits, which are also called exertions. These are things like hitting, punching, being punched, jumping, climbing, dying, anything typically where a character goes or something similar. These all fall under your remit as a narrative designer to create and track as part of a line count. So have you taken these into account? How many vocalizations should you have? If you're doing vocalizations, what sets them off? Being shot with different weapon types, taking fire damage, taking ice damage. Does a generic pained yelling cover all of this? Dialogue priority, I've mentioned it already, but let's go into some more detail. You are effectively always playing rock, paper, scissors, Uno reverse in some scenes with dialogue. Global lines beat out vocalizations, mission VO beats out globals, but vocalizations can beat out both of them at any given time, because if someone ran on stage and punched me now, I would be stopping to go, or similar. But then what if the globals are more important than another global? Oh boy, I found a treasure chest is a good little line to pop off while you're opening that chest, but if your squad mate throws a grenade, you need to know about that because that impacts on top of you. It's a player input generated global as well, so should that get priority? On the subject of player input generated global barks, replay rates. How often should a line play? Should it replay at all? If I've got a tagline where I can go, hey, I found some ammo over here, should that be something that you can let the player spam with a tag button to get hey, 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 or should it have replay delays that stop that from happening? Conversely, how often should something like I'm on low health line be fired off? Every 30 seconds when you're at low health? A 50-50 chance every 60 seconds when you're at that point? Or should it just immediately play once you hit that criteria and not play again until you hit that again? Ultimately, this is all a balancing act. You're never really going to be happy with it, so it's just about finding the best of what you think works while playing, developing, and iterating on the title. I've mentioned this before, but again, fail state conditions. If you're writing a big dramatic scene, is that better as a cutscene? If the player can interact with the playable space, can you take away their autonomy? Should you take away their autonomy? Should you account for and then they run in with a bazooka and kill everyone? Yes, yes, you should. How are you going to make sure the information that narrative was handing out is going to be conveyed if you kill everyone? Are you going to put it in a collectible, i.e., if I kill someone, can I then find a note written by them going, Hans, you're never going to guess what I've done with the missile codes? Is there another location where I can overhear a variant of that call, or is this just something that you can allow to fall through because ultimately it's just plot irrelevant? After that, you've got actor considerations. Do you accidentally have someone talking to themselves? Are you tracking the actors that you've cast with the characters that they're playing? A good example of this, in Sniper, German Grunt 1 and German Officer 1 are the same guy. If they are talking to each other, you can tell it's the same guy, so we have to try and put blockers in to stop that from happening. Line count. How much written content is in your game total? How is it broken down across characters? What is the breakdown of lines per character type? Do you have all this info to hand so that when production come asking you for it, you can get it to them quickly as opposed to rushing around for an hour trying to scrape it together? Off the back of this, how much cascading VO do you actually have with variants? If your AI character has 3,000 lines of VO, but you have 4 variants of that character's, you've now got 12,000 lines of dialogue in your game that has to be costed and accounted for. Accessibility, you're writing the subtitles, so you should be concerned with how they're displaying on screen. BBC subtitle guidelines are a great point of reference for this. My point with all of this is, being a good narrative designer, you should have a lot more skills than just writing. Not least of which is collaboration. A lot of this job is going to be back and forth with other departments. Anything that you've written up for a cutscene has to be deliverable in the game. Do you have the assets for it? Are there resources to build a chase scene? Does art have the scope to create a super unique asset just for 10 seconds of screen time? If you've written up a big sequence about characters performing an elaborate series of events, what does that look like in terms of the play space? How is it going to take place? How many AI actors are involved versus how many voice actors that you have to hand? Is that line too long for the relevant animation if the animation was captured first and the dialogue captured second? After that, we get into stuff like gameplay. Can the mechanic of the dialogue that you've been asked to write be facilitated by the engine, or do you have to check with the relevant departments? I've lost my place. Good communication is something expected of every department. You cannot all just assume that everyone is singing from the same sheet. Miscommunication is a constant in any job, never mind the games industry. If you sequestered yourself off in your writing tower and you have written a load of content that specifically calls out red doors, but art have been doing nothing but making blue doors, that is a knock-on to someone's workload. Basically, the point I'm trying to make is that a unicorn versus a writer will be able to take the rest of their team's workload into consideration and act as a bridge to make sure everything comes together in a way that creates the best outcome for everyone. Even then, I appreciate aiming to be a unicorn long-term is great, but to start with, you should all aim to have a solid jack-of-all-trades understanding of how things work. As a narrative designer, I do not need to know how to write up AI awareness code, but if I know how the AI awareness behavior works in the game, I can write better informed VO as a result. Just as your work impacts other departments will impact your work. And speaking from experience, making your job easier is not a top priority for other people, which is where communication and collaboration comes in. Be approachable, be polite, and aim to take other departments' workloads into account as part of your work. This is what I meant by there is a lot of overlap between asking about being a narrative designer and how to become a lead quickly. Being a narrative designer does not suddenly make you the grand overlord of a project. The worst narrative designers I have worked with have all disregarded other departments as irrelevant to their workload and acted in a silo. At best, this causes scrambles to rework 2 months' worth of someone else's time to create a rushed compromise. At worst, you are now cutting content wholesale as it is entirely redundant with no way to implement it. Hopefully, the point that I'm drilling in with this message, that collaboration is key, and that being a narrative designer is usually a lot more focused on the design part of the job description rather than the narrative part. So, in a full game cycle, you are likely going to spend a third of that time writing content that ends up in front of the player in some way, which is why a good chunk of studios just outsource the writing work. If you're an in-house narrative designer, the bulk of your time will be spent writing supporting documentation for other departments to help with the collaborative efforts we've gone over. A good month of my time on Sniper Elite 5 was creating uniform and loadout trackers so that animation knew how to dress characters in cutscenes and that art knew what uniforms the characters needed to wear at any given moment. You might think that's a huge amount of work for a small thing, but on a World War II game, they are really on it with the fan base of that. When I wasn't writing documentation or dialogue, I was then handling implementation and systems design, working with core tech to improve the engine tools to make asset creation a lot easier. Basically, just to hammer it home again, there is a lot more design involved with being a narrative designer than there is narrative in a large amount of instances. If you are a competent designer with a good understanding of pacing, tone, and delivery who can write functional content, you have a lot more long-term job flexibility than just someone that is the in-house writer and does not know how to touch tools. As a general point, and to stress the importance of tone, pacing, delivery, as well as collaboration, if you want to be a narrative designer, get very comfortable with the fact there is a press X to skip all of your work button. Despite my job being to write up narrative sequences or events or text entries for titles, I know the vast majority of players just skip through it because I skip through it. So brevity is the soul of wit, he said, nearing the end of his 30-minute talk, and video games are games first and foremost. Player attention is an extremely finite resource. Front-load important information whenever you can and keep your tone, pacing, and delivery consistent to keep players engaged. So as we come to the close of this, I just want to go back to the Venn diagram and kind of stress the importance of not being taken advantage of as an employee while this is narrative focused. It's a good general point as you all go and approach the job market after university. Narrative design is a very loose term for a lot of companies still. If you let them, they will give you a large amount of rope to hang yourself with. Lots of companies still have very toxic, crunch-driven cultures that do not care how the job gets done so long as it's done by a certain date. Some of these companies have this culture while publicly saying they don't. The industry is getting better with this attitude, but it is an interesting time at the minute, and narrative design is a very competitive field. Design tests will range from generic, just checking technical competency, to do 3 weeks worth of work for free and hopefully get the job. Differing descriptions of the role are in part a large reason behind this, in my opinion. It's not helped by a general ignorance of what the job role is, depending on certain studios. The industry is still very informal when it chooses to be. Basically, do your research when you apply for jobs. Read over Glassdoor reviews, look for common themes, contact people you know who work there already, ask them about the culture. As cool as this job is, it is still just a job. It is not worth your physical or mental health. So, having said all that, narrative design is a very cool job. If you're doing it well, you get to work with and collaborate with most disciplines in the creation of a game. Depending on the studio you do it at, you get to be a contributing factor to a large amount of design decisions. As with any job in the industry, you can learn a lot about how games are made by taking into consideration how your work knocks onto and impacts other departments in your workflow if you take the time to talk to those departments. On the worst days, this job is cutting content, data entry, writer's block, and chasing down production issues. On the best days, you get to write up and implement extremely fun and engaging content for the players to enjoy when they buy the game. Or at least those are the expectations of a narrative designer you should all have. Any questions? Also applause. Or questions, more important. That was so natural and unforced. Well done. Yes, question at the front. Is there mics, I think?
You did gameplay design and production, right? What would you say to someone who's also now just doing this course? Like, what advice would you give to them?
So I would just stress gameplay design and production that I did. I was on the first year of it. I was on the guinea pig year. What I did versus what you guys are doing now is vastly different. The advice I would therefore have is just general what to do at university advice, which hopefully, is fine for this question. If not, I'm happy to answer any more questions after the talk. But generally speaking, this is the most free time any of you are ever going to have again in your lives. Use this time to do portfolios, use this time to network, try and build those connections. This is a really small industry and everyone has been where you are. At worst, they just won't reply. At best, you will get questions answered if you ask the industry professionals. Has that answered your question? I appreciate it's not the answer you were looking for.
Yeah, it has.
Cool,
Thanks.
awesome. If you've got any more, ask me afterwards. Cool. Anyone else? Down at the front, or at the back. There's people I can't see. Hello.
Hi. In the case of collaboration, when there's a point where you've been pulled in for a narrative job, but the gameplay is very rigid, how do you make it more cohesive?
So that's a really good question. With the gameplay being quite rigid and the narrative being there, again, it depends on the studio. With stuff like, I'll use Sniper as the example. So Sniper is always going to be a World War II shoot Hitler in the balls simulator. While working on that, you do want to think, well, we could explore a lot more stuff. You could do a lot more in-depth character work, but ultimately the game doesn't lend itself towards that. And that's a consideration you have to work around as a designer on a title like that, which I don't have a problem with. Some designers do, because obviously you want to be creative, but if your brief is just write dialogue, you know, for this plank of wood, that's what you have to do at the end of the day. It's finding the balance, but ultimately someone has to make a decision and you have to go through with that to ship a title. Does that answer your question? Awesome. Sorry.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm curious how you got into being a narrative designer. Obviously, you're on a production
So am I.
course.
Yeah, sure. So I can give you a brief rundown. As I say, I started out at Rebellion in QA. After that, I got into level design. I was very lucky working at Rebellion when I did, because there was a lot of mobility between departments, and I was extremely lucky working on Strange Brigade as my first title. That game was extremely dialogue heavy, and I'm the one that ran with the dialogue mechanic the most while we were in early dev. So like, the thought process was, we'll have this narrator, he'll comment on everything, and my level just had, if you did anything, there'd be, good Lord, Strange Brigade, watch out for all these murderous mummies. So off the back of that, I did a lot of the writing first pass stuff with the writer, Gordon Rennie. It started coming back that the work he was sending back to me was mostly what I'd written anyway, so we just started using my work. That continued into Zombie Army, and that continued into Sniper, where I was the principal narrative on it. My path into this is obviously not traditionally, I applied for a narrative job. I got into this through that. Narrative is a very tough field to break into, I appreciate. There's lots of internships that pop up, but they're very competitive. What I would recommend if you want to get into this field is just keep your design skills, you know, as sharp as they can be, and just keep dialogue considerations in mind. A lot of people show me, you know, walking simulators as their portfolio piece, and that's great. From my own experience, I would much rather see as a portfolio piece. Like if you just downloaded Lyra, the Unreal team shooter framework, and just added barks to any criteria, that would be something I go, well, that's good. He's taken into account what his job is likely to be. So like, if it's just them going, I'm reloading, I've taken damage, oh, I've been shot. Yes, if you can get that working, that's great as a portfolio piece, and that's how I'd recommend trying to move into it if you're trying to go for it from that type of thing. Does that answer your question? Awesome. We've got a question down the front.
Hi.
Hello.
First, thank you for your talk. It was very interesting.
Sorry.
My question is more related to a graduate point of view. So I recently graduated, and I would love to go into narrative design. However, the biggest issue is the portfolio. As we know, narrative design is a very competitive field, so it would be great to go more into a specialization, so into the small niche. However, when it comes to the portfolio, I went to some networking event, and most people said, oh, it's too wordy, or it's not wordy enough. So how can I make my portfolio specialize if I don't have it just yet?
What I would suggest for good portfolio best practice is look at people that recently graduated and got the job you're after.
Okay.
That is then the standard you should be aiming to emulate or model yourself after. If you come up to me after this, I can show you my Limit Break mentees from last year's portfolios. They've both gone into careers in the industry now, one at 11 and one at Cloud Imperium. That's just a good start from. With the portfolio, the general advice should be just keep the information that you want recruiters to see as foremost as possible. The more stuff you have to click through, the more as a recruiter or someone looking at your portfolio, it'll just be, how many more times do I have to press? There's the work I want. Like, just make your most important stuff front-facing.
Yeah.
Has that answered your question? I appreciate it's pretty vague.
Yes, I only have just one little tiny bit to add. Would you reckon that I can make my script available on request? Because I don't want to give away my work
Yeah,
to
if you
anyone.
password protecting stuff in your portfolio is entirely fine. There's lots of people that have NDA work that they can't publicly show, but they've got password protected ways to do it.
Yeah.
If you're not wanting to show off your work, that's fine. Just when you have the thing, go, if you want to look at more in-depth stuff, here are my passwords, and hand those out to recruiters accordingly.
Okay.
Be how we do it.
Well, thank
Anything
you.
else?
Yeah.
Awesome. Any other questions? To the back? Or try that.
Hi. I was wondering, where do you usually find in the process sort of narrative and game design and level design sort of intersect? For example, your example of the named character in the level, would that come from narrative being, you know, we need this character in this area, or game design going, we need a
to
target?
use that specific point as an example, like I said, I need to talk to the level designer. Spoilers, that level designer was me, so it was fine. But from there, like, there's not a lot of thought that really goes into naming characters when I'm writing that kind of content. It's just what German name am I pulling from the phone book today? But then that, of course, becomes a name that you have to track. So I just keep a note, like, while writing the dialogue in the system, I had a Confluence page open. If I named a character in dialogue, I then stuck that in the Confluence page going, you now have this guy as a name that's going to have to stick on your character through bino info in this. And then just with the designer, you make sure that you're keeping in the loop. Like if that content gets reshuffled, then maybe the line gets dropped. So it's just about keeping that good communication. In terms of more like level design and, you know, game design stuff, the pacing and the spacing out of things really is, I think, the best example. As a narrative designer, you do always think, oh, people are going to sit there and they're going to listen intently to everything that I've written and is being delivered. They won't. They're just going to speed past all of it. So just keep that in mind while you're doing it. Like, how can someone break this logic? Like if someone starts this conversation and then just keeps running, can it be done before that? A good example in terms of like line length versus delivery. So in Strange Brigade, we had a character that was like a scholar-themed character called Archimedes. The original dialogue that came back from our writer on that was, yeah, I envision him as a Iliad quoting warrior poet. And I was like, that's great, but if you've got a paragraph of dialogue for Grenade VO that takes 30 seconds to deliver, and the grenade recharge timer is 10, we're just going to change that to grenade out. So just, it's about, as I've said, like, keep in mind what you're working on, keep in mind how that impacts. It's all iterative in this job, so just keep playing it and testing it and seeing what works. Has that answered your question?
Yeah, amazing. Thank you so
Awesome.
much.
Anyone else? I think there was one down here earlier. I've kind of sort of answered it, that's fine, but don't want to put you on the spot.
I mean, you sort of answered it, but I might as well ask it. What kind of portfolio pieces would be expected of, like, a narrative design, like, portfolio?
No, that's perfectly fine. So what I'd expect from graduates is, because as I said, like, walking simulators are fine, but that isn't massively going to be your job in a thing. If you've got, like, for my one, for example, I've got in my writing samples scripts I've worked on, character barks that I've worked on for Strange Brigade, and with Stellaris, I've used that to be like, here's the work I did for Biogenesis, and that just showcases mission scripts and the delivery of that in game. It showcases here is text entry that has multiple choices, and then it's got the character barks just to kind of break down that. And you don't have to have shipped titles to do that. You could do a portfolio piece of, like, Rebellion's education website has a level design brief for people to write up like a fake level in Sniper. If you took that and then just went, here's the intro cutscene for the level, here's a bunch of German AI that I've written up dialogue for, here are some collectibles that reveal where the V2 bombs are hidden or something. So, like, make a fake level and just go through and do what you find in games. So dialogue, mission objectives, character barks, and like a big cutscene, I think, is a good starting point. Again, as I said, compare what you're doing with people that have gotten jobs in the industry so you know what to model after as well. Is that helped expand on it?
Thank you so much.
Awesome. Anything else? Are we right at the back? How are we doing for time? Last one. Okay. If anyone has questions after this, I will be down the bar and I will answer a lot more questions in depth because I will not be being recorded.
Hello.
Hello.
You've spoken a lot about like narrative design for games that have dialogue, but how would you approach a game that doesn't necessarily have dialogue, such as Unpacking? Would it be similar, or would it be very like a entirely different approach?
But when you said a game without dialogue, you said Unpacking. Is that a game?
So Unpacking is a game where you basically unpack a person's belongings into a room.
Because again, like, you know, we had a project at Reb, which I can't talk about because there's NDAs involved, but, and even with stuff like, you know, Sniper, there's not really a huge amount of plot in that. You just go, what super weapon are we blowing up this year? With stuff I've worked on, like, you know, Stellaris, for example, ultimately all I'm writing is just, here is justification to get +5 energy on this planet. If it's something like Unpacking, you don't need to have big, sprawling, emotive stuff, but there will be written text in there. There's stuff that, builds towards what that end project is. I've not played the game in question, so I can't, speak to it. But a good example, like something like Minecraft, there's narrative in that, even if you don't have it explicitly said to you, you know what it is by finding it. So generally, just if you're approaching something and you don't want it to be dialogue heavy, you want it to be more suggestive, use the environment, use emergent storytelling. There's ways to tell a story without having spoken VO. And that can even just boil down to simple things like you find a note that goes, I'm unpacking today. Where did I put the kettle? I haven't played this game. I assume there's a kettle in it.
Yes, there is.
Cool. On that triumphant note, I think that was the last question. Thanks very much for coming. Hope you all enjoyed it.